The fatal miscalculation. The Sentinel Hall stretched across 3 kilometers of pristine crystalline architecture, floating in the void between stars. Within its transparent walls, representatives from 412 species gathered in what they believed would be a routine enforcement meeting. The air shimmered with translation fields, converting thousands of languages into comprehensible thought patterns. At the center platform stood Ambassador Toral, his silver carapace reflecting the ambient light as he prepared to address the assembly with a matter he considered simple and straightforward. Toral had served the Galactic Council for 270 years, long enough to see dozens of upstart civilizations brought into line. The humans were no different, he assured himself. Just another primitive species that needed guidance, perhaps a firm hand to understand their place in the established order. He activated the holographic display, and Earth appeared above the assembly, a small blue world spinning peacefully in the darkness. Around it, red markers indicated the 27 systems humans had colonized in just 150 years, each one a violation of expansion protocols that civilized species had followed for millennia. The numbers spoke clearly. Human vessels had crossed into protected zones 43 times in the past decade. They had established mining operations on asteroids claimed by the Torvin Collective. Their survey ships had ignored quarantine beacons around developing worlds. Most troubling, they had refused every diplomatic summons, every attempt at communication, every warning the Council had issued. They acted as if the galaxy belonged to them alone, as if 10,000 years of established law meant nothing to their ambitions. Toral began his presentation with confidence that bordered on boredom. The humans possessed basic fusion drives that could barely push their ships to half-light speed. Their largest vessel massed only 50,000 tons, little more than a courier ship by Council standards. They had no graviton manipulation, no quantum entanglement communication, no neural interface technology. By every metric that mattered, they were centuries behind even the youngest Council member species. The vote to authorize disciplinary action took less than an hour, with only 16 dissenting voices among the 412 representatives present. Commander Vex received his orders while orbiting the fortress world of Cromnar Prime. He was a Valkor, a species bred for military service over thousands of generations. His people had never lost a Council enforcement action in their 800-year history of service. The mission seemed almost insultingly simple. Take his battle group of 80 warships to the Sol system, disable the human military capability, occupy their major colonies, and establish Council authority. The tactical briefings estimated the operation would require no more than 6 weeks from start to finish. Vex assembled his commanders in the war room of his flagship, the Inevitable Judgment. The holographic display showed the Sol system in detail, with human assets marked in red. 62 military vessels scattered across 8 planets and 30 major stations. Their defense grid looked primitive, relying on kinetic weapons and chemical explosives. Some of their ships still used physical armor plating instead of energy shields. One of Vex's junior officers asked if this was a training exercise rather than an actual combat deployment, and several others laughed at the observation. The battle group entered the Sol system at the heliopause, their arrival announced by the massive gravitational distortions their drives created. Vex expected panic, perhaps desperate attempts at negotiation, possibly even immediate surrender once the humans understood the force arrayed against them. Instead, the human response came within minutes, and it was not what anyone expected. A single transmission, audio only, speaking in clear Council standard language. The voice belonged to someone who identified herself as Director Chen of the Earth Defense Coordination Committee. Director Chen's message was brief and utterly unexpected. She thanked the Council for making their intentions clear. She acknowledged that human vessels had indeed violated Council protocols, and she apologized if this had caused offense. Then she said something that made Vex's tactical officer actually laugh out loud. She politely declined the Council's authority over human space, suggested that the Council fleet should return home, and promised that any hostile action would be met with appropriate response. The transmission ended with a phrase that would later become famous across the galaxy. She said humans had a saying about uninvited guests who overstayed their welcome, and the Council fleet was no longer welcome in their home. Vex transmitted the standard ultimatum. Power down all military vessels within 12 hours. Evacuate all military installations. Prepare for Council authority to assume control of human space until proper civilization protocols could be established. He gave them time to understand the futility of resistance, time to recognize the overwhelming force that surrounded their small system. When the deadline expired, not a single human ship had powered down. Not one station had evacuated. Instead, the human vessels began moving into positions that made no tactical sense whatsoever. The battle began when a human destroyer called the Resolute broke formation and accelerated directly toward Vex's formation. His tactical officer tagged it as a suicide run, probably some desperate attempt at ramming. The Valkor point defense systems locked on, ready to vaporize the primitive vessel long before it could pose any threat. Then the Resolute launched its entire missile complement, 140 warheads that scattered across a three-dimensional sphere. The Valkor systems tracked them easily, calculating intercept solutions for every projectile. What happened next would be analyzed and debated for years to come. 90% of the missiles were decoys, cheap constructs designed to overwhelm targeting systems. The remaining 14 carried nuclear warheads wrapped in ablative shielding and powered by drives that could accelerate to 20% light speed in 30 seconds. They came in too fast for the automated defenses, and 3 of them found targets before the Valkor crews could manually adjust their fire solutions. 2 frigates and a destroyer vanished in nuclear fire, and suddenly the humans had demonstrated they understood exactly how to exploit the weaknesses in supposedly superior technology. The human fleet did not fight like any opponent Vex had ever faced. They did not form defensive lines or attempt to protect key assets. Instead, every ship acted independently, using attack vectors that maximized confusion and forced the Valkor fleet to split its attention across hundreds of individual threats. When ships took critical damage, they did not retreat or surrender. They accelerated toward the nearest Council vessel and detonated their reactors at point-blank range. In the first 6 hours of combat, Vex lost 18 ships to these kamikaze tactics alone. What troubled Vex more than the losses was the psychological impact on his crews. Valkor warriors were trained to understand military logic, to calculate risk and reward, to know when an enemy was beaten and should surrender. The humans seemed to operate under different rules entirely. Intercepted communications revealed human captains singing as they made their final attack runs. Others recited poetry or called out names that meant nothing to Valkor databases. One ship transmitted a message that simply said, "Remember the Alamo," before ramming a Valkor heavy cruiser, and analysis later revealed this referred to a battle from human history, where a small force had died to the last individual rather than surrender. After 3 days of continuous combat, the human fleet was effectively destroyed. Vex had achieved his primary objective, but the cost had been catastrophic. 41 of his 80 ships were gone, and another 15 were too damaged to continue combat operations. His casualties exceeded 60%, numbers that would have been considered disastrous against any peer military force, let alone primitives with inferior technology. The reports he transmitted back to Council Command were factual and precise, but he knew they would not be believed. No one who had not fought humans could understand what made them so dangerous. The ground invasion of Mars colony revealed another dimension of human resistance. Intelligence had indicated a population of 300,000 civilians with perhaps 2,000 security personnel. Vex deployed 6,000 Valkor warriors expecting to secure the colony within days. Instead, they encountered prepared resistance from virtually every human colonist capable of holding a weapon. The elderly fought alongside the young. Civilians who should have been sheltering instead set ambushes and booby traps. One residential building held out for 18 hours, defended by a family of 7 who wounded or killed 32 Valkor soldiers before being overwhelmed. The Valkor warriors reported something none of their training had prepared them for. Humans did not seem to process fear the way civilized species did. When cornered, they attacked. When wounded, they continued fighting until physically unable to move. Captured humans showed no signs of submission or defeat, instead staring at their captors with expressions that Valkor psychologists struggled to interpret. One captured human soldier, when asked why she had not surrendered when clearly defeated, had looked genuinely confused by the question. She said her people had a simple rule passed down through generations: you never quit when someone is trying to hurt your family. The concept seemed so alien to Valkor thinking that the interrogation officer filed a request for psychiatric evaluation. Back on Earth, Director Chen watched the battle reports with grim satisfaction mixed with profound sadness. Every ship lost represented hundreds of lives, people she had known, trained with, laughed with. The defense strategy had cost them nearly everything they had in space, but it had accomplished something more important. It had sent a message to the galaxy that humans would not be subjugated easily. More critically, it had bought time for the transformation happening across every human world and station. The industrial capacity that had built colonies across 27 star systems was now focused entirely on a single purpose. Shipyards that had produced ore haulers and passenger transports began assembling warships using designs that had been theoretical until 6 months ago. Mining operations that had extracted resources for construction now fed weapons foundries. Research facilities that had studied stellar phenomena now developed military applications for every technology humans possessed. The entire species was transforming itself into a war machine with speed that shocked even Chen, who had helped plan the mobilization. What the Council did not know, what their intelligence had completely failed to detect, was that humans had been preparing for this possibility for decades. Not specifically for the Council, but for any potential threat from the stars. Humanity's expansion into space had been driven partly by curiosity and ambition, but also by a deep-seated fear that had haunted the species since they first looked up at the stars and wondered what else might be looking back. Every ship design included military conversion specifications. Every colony had hidden weapon caches. Every station had been built with defense in mind. The humans had hoped they would never need these preparations, but they had made them anyway, because hope was not a strategy. The first new warships began launching from Earth orbit 2 weeks into the conflict. These were not the improvised conversions that had fought in the opening battles. These were purpose-built combat vessels, incorporating lessons learned from captured Valcor technology and refined through analysis of every engagement. They were smaller than traditional warships, fast and heavily armed for their size, designed to be produced quickly in massive numbers. The humans called them Swarm-class frigates, and the name was disturbingly appropriate. Where the Council built ships to last centuries, humans built ships to fight and die within months, calculating that they could replace losses faster than any opponent could sustain an extended campaign. Commander Vex received intelligence reports about the new human production capacity with growing alarm. His tactical staff dismissed the numbers as errors or propaganda, insisting no species could possibly ramp up military production so quickly. But Vex had fought the humans. He had seen how they adapted, how they learned, how they simply refused to accept defeat. When his scouts reported that humans were launching 4 new warships per week from Earth alone, with another dozen yards coming online across their colonies, he knew the numbers were real. The humans were not fighting to win. They were fighting to survive, and there was no limit to what they would do. The Council's response to Vex's situation reports revealed a fundamental disconnect between those who had fought humans and those who had merely voted to discipline them. Ambassador Toral transmitted orders for immediate offensive operations against Earth itself, suggesting that crushing the human homeworld would break their will to resist. The orders revealed such complete misunderstanding of human psychology that Vex actually laughed, a harsh sound that startled his bridge crew. He transmitted a response that violated several protocols regarding communication with civilian authority, but he no longer cared about protocols. He told Toral that attacking Earth would not break human resistance. It would unleash something the galaxy had never seen, and whatever humanity had shown so far would pale in comparison to what they would become if their homeworld was threatened directly. The Council's reinforcement fleet arrived in the Sol system during the 4th month of the conflict. 200 fresh warships with crews who had not yet learned to fear the humans. Vex watched them take up formation with the confidence of warriors who had never met an enemy they could not overwhelm through sheer superiority of numbers and technology. He transmitted all his tactical data, all his observations, all his warnings about what made humans dangerous. The reinforcement commander acknowledged receipt of the information, then proceeded to ignore every recommendation Vex had made. The new fleet arranged itself in textbook formation and prepared to advance on Earth itself. Director Chen received reports of the Council reinforcements with no visible emotion, though those who knew her well saw the tightness around her eyes that indicated stress. The situation was exactly as her strategic planning team had predicted. The Council would escalate, committing more resources, more ships, more warriors to what they still believed was a simple enforcement action. Every ship they sent to Sol system was a ship not defending their own territory, and that was about to become very important. She opened a secured channel to Captain Rivera, who commanded the newly formed Human Expeditionary Fleet, and transmitted a single-word authorization code. Captain Rivera smiled when she received it, a smile that held no warmth at all, and gave the order her crews had been waiting for. 23 human task forces simultaneously jumped into Council space across a front spanning 200 light-years. They struck at logistics bases, supply depots, communication relays, and isolated outposts. They did not seek honorable battle or attempt to hold territory. They destroyed everything they could reach and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. The humans had studied Council infrastructure for months, mapping every vulnerable point, every critical node, every system that would hurt when damaged. Now they demonstrated that two could play the expansion game, and humans had learned to play it very, very well. The raids spread chaos through Council space in ways that simple military defeat could not. Species that had relied on Council protection for centuries suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Supply chains that had functioned for millennia were disrupted. Communication networks went dark across entire sectors, and everywhere the humans struck, they left messages. Some were simple statements of fact, informing the local population that humans had no quarrel with them, only with the Council that had authorized invasion of human space. Other messages were more pointed, reminding species that had voted for the invasion that humans had very long memories and very specific plans for those who had supported attacking Earth. Back in the Sentinel Hall, Ambassador Terrell faced something he had never experienced in 270 years of service. The Council was fracturing. Species that had voted for the invasion now demanded immediate withdrawal. Others insisted on escalation, arguing that retreating would destroy Council authority forever. Accusations flew across the assembly. Some blamed Toril for underestimating the humans. Others blamed Commander Vex for tactical failures. A few brave voices suggested that perhaps the entire concept of forcing compliance on unwilling species needed to be reconsidered. Though these voices were quickly shouted down, the debate raged for weeks while the war continued to spread. Human raiders struck deeper into Council territory, targeting not military installations now but economic infrastructure. Trade routes became unsafe. Mining operations were abandoned. Colonies that had never considered themselves at risk suddenly found themselves wondering if humans would appear in their skies. The psychological impact exceeded the military damage, as billions of Council citizens began to question whether their government could actually protect them from this unexpected threat. Commander Vex watched the reports from across Council space and recognized the strategy. The humans were not trying to conquer territory or destroy the Council militarily. They were demonstrating that the Council could not protect its own people, that the vaunted unity and strength of galactic civilization was an illusion that could be shattered by one determined species with nothing to lose. It was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly human. They were not fighting a war. They were teaching a lesson, and the tuition was being paid in Council blood and treasure. The breaking point came when 3 Council species announced they were withdrawing from the Mutual Defense Pact. They had not been attacked, had not suffered losses, but they had watched the humans operate for 5 months and reached a simple conclusion. If humanity could do this to the Council while fighting a defensive war in their own space, what could they do if truly unleashed? Better to make peace now, to recognize human sovereignty, to treat them as equals rather than primitives to be disciplined. The withdrawals created a cascade effect as other species reconsidered their positions. In the Sol system, the reinforcement fleet that had arrived with such confidence was learning the same lessons Vex's original force had learned. Human resistance had not weakened. If anything, it had intensified as new ships and weapons entered service. The Swarm-class frigates proved devastatingly effective in large numbers, swarming isolated Council ships and overwhelming them through coordinated attacks. Captured Valcor officers reported that fighting humans felt like drowning, each wave of attack slightly stronger than the last, never giving time to recover or adapt. Director Chen stood in the command center deep beneath Earth's surface and watched the strategic display with exhausted but determined eyes. 5 months of total war had cost humanity dearly. Civilian casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Entire colonies had been damaged or destroyed. The economic cost would take generations to recover from, but they had achieved something that mattered more than any of that. They had made the galaxy understand that humans could not be conquered, could not be intimidated, could not be forced into submission. The price had been terrible, but the alternative would have been worse. The communications console chimed with an incoming priority transmission. Chen recognized the encryption pattern as Council diplomatic channels, the first such contact since the war began. She authorized the connection, and Ambassador Toral's image appeared on the screen. He looked older than in his earlier broadcasts, his silver carapace somehow duller, his bearing less confident. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the casual arrogance from his presentation to the Council 5 months earlier. Toral requested a cessation of hostilities and preliminary discussions regarding a permanent resolution to the conflict. Chen listened without interrupting, noting the careful word choices, the implicit acknowledgement that the Council's disciplinary action had failed completely. When Toral finished speaking, Chen responded with words she had been preparing for months, words that would define humanity's relationship with the galaxy for generations to come. She said humans would consider peace, but only on terms that recognized human sovereignty absolutely and without qualification. The Council could keep its laws and its protocols, but they would not apply to human space unless humans chose to adopt them. The galaxy would have to make room for a species that did not ask permission to exist. Toral listened to Chen's terms with visible discomfort, knowing that accepting them would fundamentally alter the galactic order. But he also knew the alternative was continuing a war the Council could not win, watching more species withdraw from the Alliance, seeing centuries of carefully built authority crumble under human pressure. He said he would present the terms to the Council, and though he could not promise acceptance, he believed the votes existed for a negotiated settlement. The transmission ended, leaving Chen alone with her thoughts and the terrible weight of what humanity had accomplished and what it had cost. The unraveling order. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened under circumstances that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The Sentinel Hall, usually filled with confident representatives secure in their civilization's superiority, now hosted a gathering marked by fear, anger, and recrimination. Ambassador Toral stood at the central podium once again, but this time he faced an assembly that blamed him for a disaster none of them had predicted. The holographic display showed not Earth's violations of expansion protocols, but the current state of Council space painted in stark red markers indicating human attacks, disrupted trade routes, and species withdrawing from mutual defense obligations. The casualties told a story that no amount of diplomatic language could soften. Commander Vex's original force of 80 warships had been reduced to fewer than 20 combat-capable vessels. The reinforcement fleet of 200 ships had fared little better, suffering 40% losses in just 8 weeks of combat. More troubling than the numbers were the reports from Valcor commanders describing the evolution of human tactics. Every battle revealed new weapons, new strategies, new ways of exploiting Council vulnerabilities. The humans were learning faster than any species in recorded history, adapting and improving with each engagement. The economic damage exceeded the military losses in long-term impact. 17 major trade routes had been closed due to human raider activity. Mining operations across 43 systems had been abandoned or reduced to skeleton crews. Insurance rates for commercial shipping had increased by 300% in Council space, and several smaller species were facing economic collapse as their trade-dependent economies ground to a halt. The humans had not conquered any territory, but they had demonstrated that the Council could not guarantee safe commerce, and that revelation was destroying confidence in galactic civilization itself. Representative Calmore of the Torvin Collective stood to address the assembly, his 3 eyes all focused on Toral with unmistakable accusation. The Torvin were merchants and traders, species who had prospered under Council protection for 2,000 years. Now their shipping fleets sat idle in protected harbors, afraid to venture into space where human raiders might appear without warning. Calmore's voice carried the anger of a people watching their prosperity dissolve, and his words cut through the diplomatic pretense that usually governed council discourse. Calmore reminded the assembly that he had voted for the disciplinary action, trusting Toral's assessment that humans were primitive and easily managed. He had believed the intelligence reports, the technological assessments, the confident predictions of swift victory. Now his people were facing economic ruin because the council had started a war it could not win against an enemy it did not understand. He demanded to know who would be held accountable for this catastrophe, and his question resonated through the chamber as hundreds of other representatives nodded agreement or vocalized their own species equivalent of approval. The response came from an unexpected source. Observer Mareth, who represented the archival caste, rarely spoke at council sessions. Her order dedicated itself to studying and recording galactic history, maintaining libraries that stretched back millions of years. When she rose from her seat, the chamber gradually fell silent out of respect for her position, though many wondered what the keepers of history could contribute to immediate military and economic crises. Mareth's voice was quiet but clear as she addressed not the immediate situation but the fundamental assumptions that had led the council into disaster. Mareth explained that her order had been studying human, cultural and historical data since first contact, attempting to understand a species that had developed so differently from established patterns. What they discovered should have served as warning, but the data had been dismissed as irrelevant by those focused only on technological capability. Humans were not simply another intelligent species following familiar development paths. They were something that appeared rarely in galactic history, a species that had evolved not just to survive, but to thrive under conditions of constant threat and competition. The holographic display shifted to show Earth as it had existed 50,000 years earlier, locked in an ice age that had nearly exterminated early humanity. Mareth described how humans had survived through cooperation, innovation, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept extinction. She showed the development of human civilization, noting that humans had never known true peace. Even their golden ages had been marked by conflict, competition, and preparation for the next war. Where most species developed civilization as a means of reducing conflict, humans had developed civilization as a more efficient way of organizing for conflict. The analysis grew more disturbing as Mareth continued. Humans possessed something the archival caste called evolutionary momentum, the ability to adapt and change at rates that defied normal biological and cultural development. In the 200 years since achieving space travel, humans had undergone more social, technological, and cultural change than most species experienced in 10,000 years. They had no concept of stagnation, no satisfaction with achieved success, no acceptance of limits. Every problem became a challenge to overcome. Every barrier became a puzzle to solve. And failure was never final but always a lesson for future attempts. What made humans truly dangerous, Mareth explained, was not their technology or tactics but their psychology. Most intelligent species developed risk aversion as they evolved, learning that caution and cooperation led to survival. Humans had evolved differently, developing what their own psychologists called optimism bias, the tendency to believe they could overcome any obstacle if they tried hard enough. This trait had let them attempt things that should have been impossible, and sometimes they succeeded purely because they did not understand they were supposed to fail. Combined with their ability to function effectively under extreme stress, this made humans uniquely difficult to defeat through conventional military pressure. The chamber listened with growing unease as Mareth described human warfare throughout their history. Battles where outnumbered forces had held against impossible odds. Sieges that had lasted years while defenders ate anything available rather than surrender. Wars that had killed millions yet continued until one side was completely destroyed. Humans did not view war as a failure of diplomacy, but as diplomacy by other means, a continuation of competition using different tools. They had developed theories of total war, strategies that recognized no distinction between military and civilian targets, doctrines that accepted mutual destruction as preferable to defeat. Representative Calmore interrupted the historical lecture with obvious frustration. He said understanding why humans were dangerous did not solve the immediate problem of stopping their attacks on council space. Mareth turned to face him directly, and her next words silenced the chamber completely. She said the archival cast believed the Council could not stop human attacks through military force. Every species that had tried to conquer humans throughout their history had failed or succeeded only at costs that exceeded any possible gain. The question was not how to defeat humanity, but how to achieve peace with a species that would accept nothing less than absolute sovereignty. The strategic situation had deteriorated further while the Council debated. Captain Rivera's expeditionary forces had expanded their operations, no longer limiting themselves to hit-and-run raids. Human task forces were now establishing forward operating bases in unclaimed systems near Council territory, creating permanent threats that tied down defensive forces and required constant vigilance. More troubling, humans had begun targeting Council information infrastructure, infiltrating data networks and stealing technical specifications, economic data, and strategic planning documents. The security breaches revealed vulnerabilities no one had known existed. Commander Vex participated in the emergency session via secure transmission from the Sol system, his image appearing on a secondary display. He had been recalled to explain his failures, but his report painted a picture more complex than simple military defeat. Vex described watching human industrial capacity expand exponentially during the conflict. Earth alone was now launching 6 warships per week, with colonial yards adding another 8 vessels to that total. Human production would exceed Council military construction within 6 months if current trends continued, and the humans showed no signs of slowing their expansion. The technological analysis proved even more disturbing. Humans had reverse-engineered captured Council equipment and improved upon it in several key areas. Their new weapons used hybrid designs that combined Council technology with human innovation, creating systems that Council scientists had never considered. More concerning, humans had demonstrated capabilities that suggested they had been hiding their true technological level before the war. Their suddenly revealed artificial intelligence systems operated at sophistication levels that should have required centuries of development. Their materials science had produced armor composites that outperformed Council standards. Either humans had progressed impossibly fast, or they had been deliberately concealing their capabilities for years. The revelation about human deception sparked new debates about trustworthiness and future relations. Several representatives argued that species capable of such sustained dishonesty could never be reliable partners in any agreement. Others pointed out that humans had hidden their capabilities because they correctly predicted the Council would view them as threats, making the deception rational self-defense rather than inherent dishonesty. The argument illustrated the fundamental problem facing the Council: how to evaluate and interact with a species that thought so differently from established patterns. Director Chen authorized the next phase of human operations during the Council's debate, though she took no pleasure in the order she transmitted. Human intelligence had identified 16 Council species whose economies depended entirely on interstellar trade. These species had voted overwhelmingly for the invasion of human space, supporting military action while believing they would face no consequences. Now they would learn that decisions had costs. Human raiders received targeting packages for these species' key economic infrastructure, with orders to cause maximum disruption while minimizing casualties. The goal was not genocide, but education, teaching the galaxy that attacking humanity brought consequences that extended far beyond simple military defeat. The results exceeded even Chen's expectations. Within 2 weeks, all 16 targeted species had contacted Earth directly, bypassing Council channels to request bilateral ceasefires. They offered recognition of human sovereignty, trade agreements on favorable terms, and public apologies for supporting the invasion. Several offered information about Council military planning as gestures of goodwill. The diplomatic avalanche demonstrated that the Council's authority was dissolving, as individual species prioritized their own survival over collective security. The galactic order that had maintained stability for millennia was fragmenting under human pressure. Ambassador Toral watched his life's work crumbling with each new report of species defecting from Council consensus. He had served the Council for 270 years, believing absolutely in the mission of bringing order and civilization to the galaxy. Now he faced the possibility that the Council itself might not survive this conflict. More species were questioning whether collective security was worth the cost if it meant fighting an unwinnable war against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each battle. The fundamental bargain of Council membership, protection in exchange for adherence to common law, had been revealed as hollow when faced with a species willing to fight rather than submit. The turning point came when the Valkor hierarchy announced they were withdrawing their military forces from Council service. Commander Vex had submitted a confidential report to Valkor leadership describing in detail why continued conflict with humanity was unsustainable. The Valkor were warriors, but they were not fools. They recognized when further fighting served no purpose except accumulating casualties. Their withdrawal was not surrender but strategic reassessment, acknowledging that humanity had earned its place in the galaxy through proven combat capability. Other military species quickly followed the Valkor example, leaving the Council with no enforcement arm. Director Chen received Ambassador Toral's formal request for peace negotiations without surprise or satisfaction. 5 months of total war had cost humanity dearly. Though exact casualty figures remained classified, the economic damage would require decades to repair. An entire generation of humans had seen their futures disrupted by a war they had not started, but had been forced to fight. Chen felt the weight of every life lost, every family destroyed, every dream deferred or abandoned. Victory brought no joy when the price had been so high, but defeat would have cost even more. The preliminary negotiations revealed the extent of Council desperation. Toral's initial offers included recognition of human sovereignty over currently occupied systems, seats on various Council committees, and economic incentives for joining the Council as junior members. Chen rejected every offer that implied humanity needed Council approval to exist. She demanded absolute recognition of human independence, formal apologies from every species that had voted for invasion, and reparations for the economic damage Council military action had caused. Most critically, she insisted on human input into any future Council policies regarding contact with new species, ensuring no other civilization would face unprovoked invasion simply for expanding too quickly. The negotiations lasted 3 weeks, with multiple breakdowns and resumptions as Council factions fought over terms. Some species wanted to continue the war despite the military situation, arguing that accepting human demands would destroy Council authority forever. Others pressed for immediate peace at almost any cost, fearing that prolonged conflict would see more species abandon the alliance. Eventually, pragmatism won over pride, and the Council voted to accept human terms by the narrowest majority in its recorded history. The vote marked the end of one era of galactic civilization and the beginning of something new and uncertain. The Treaty of Solar Recognition was signed aboard a neutral trading station in unclaimed space between human and Council territory. Director Chen represented humanity, while Ambassador Toral represented the Council, though his authority was shakier now than when the war began. The treaty's text was surprisingly simple given the complexity of the conflict. The Council formally recognized human sovereignty over all systems humans currently occupied. Both sides agreed to immediate cessation of hostilities and withdrawal of military forces from contact zones. A neutral commission would calculate appropriate reparations. Most significantly, the treaty established humanity as an independent civilization equal in status to the Council itself, not a member but a peer. The signing ceremony was broadcast across both human and Council space, though reactions differed dramatically. In Council territory, many viewed the treaty as humiliating defeat, proof that their civilization had grown weak and complacent. Others saw it as necessary compromise with a species too dangerous to fight. A few forward-thinking individuals recognized it as the beginning of a new galactic order, where humanity would play a major role. In human space, the reaction was more subdued than might be expected. People were simply exhausted, ready for the war to end, hoping to rebuild what had been lost. There were no victory celebrations, no triumphant parades, only quiet relief that the dying had stopped. Commander Vex watched the ceremony from his quarters aboard what remained of his flagship. He had survived the war, though many of his warriors had not. The Valkor hierarchy had not punished him for his losses. Recognizing that he had fought as well as anyone could have against an opponent no one had properly understood. Vex had already received offers to write tactical analyses of the human campaign, to teach at military academies, to share his hard-won knowledge with a galaxy that needed to learn new lessons. He would accept some of these offers, knowing that understanding humanity was now essential for anyone serving in galactic military forces. Observer Marith returned to her archives with mixed feelings about the conflict's resolution. The archival cast would spend centuries analyzing what had happened, learning from humanity's unexpected victory, attempting to understand why their historical precedents had failed to predict the outcome. She had already begun compiling a comprehensive study of human nature, hoping to help future generations avoid similar miscalculations. The title she had chosen was simple but accurate: The Species That Refused to Lose. In the aftermath of the treaty, human-council relations remained tense but gradually improved as practical necessities overcame ideological resistance. Trade between human and council space resumed cautiously, with both sides discovering benefits from cultural exchange. Human technology began appearing in council markets, while council knowledge helped humanity solve problems that had troubled them for years. Several council species established embassies on Earth, beginning diplomatic relationships that moved from forced cooperation toward genuine partnership. The longer-term consequences of the war reshaped galactic civilization in ways no one had fully anticipated. The Council's authority never fully recovered from the damage to its reputation. More species began asserting greater independence, questioning rules they had accepted for millennia, demanding reforms to make the Council more representative and less authoritarian. The concept of enforced civilization was quietly abandoned, as species recognized that compliance could not be guaranteed through military force alone. The galaxy was becoming more diverse, more chaotic, and possibly more honest about the realities of power and sovereignty. Captain Rivera continued commanding human expeditionary forces, though their mission had changed from raiding to exploration and security. The forward operating bases established during the war became permanent human outposts, extending humanity's reach deeper into the galaxy. Some council species protested this expansion, but protests without military backing were simply noted and ignored. Humanity was carving out its place in galactic civilization through the oldest method known to intelligent life, proving that they could defend what they claimed and could not be removed by force. Director Chen retired from her position 6 months after the treaty was signed, her health compromised by the stress of leading humanity through existential war. She gave a final address that was broadcast across human space, speaking about the lessons learned and the future ahead. She reminded her audience that humanity had not sought conflict, but had proven capable of prevailing when forced to fight. She hoped future generations would use the hard-won respect humanity had earned to build something better, to explore and learn and grow without the threat of attack simply for existing. Her final words became a touchstone for human space policy. We did not want to fight, but we proved we could. Now let us prove we can do more than survive. Let us prove we can thrive. The war's legacy extended beyond immediate political and military consequences. A generation of humans had experienced total war, developing attitudes and capabilities that would shape human civilization for centuries. Military service became common, with most humans spending at least some time in defense forces. The industrial mobilization that had enabled wartime production remained partially in place, giving humanity manufacturing capacity that exceeded most council species. Perhaps most significantly, humans had lost any lingering inferiority complex about their place in galactic civilization. They had fought the Council to a standstill, and that knowledge shaped everything that followed. Ambassador Toral survived the political fallout from the war, though his influence was much diminished. He spent his remaining years